Chapter 7 of The Best Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail Mattern. The Best Man by Grace Livingston Hill. Chapter 7. Meantime, the man on the steps of the last car of the Chicago Limited was having his doubts about whether he ought to have boarded that train. He realized that the fat traveler who was hurling himself after the train had stirred in him a sudden impulse which had been only half formed before, and he had obeyed it. Perhaps he was following a wrong scent, and would lose the reward which he knew was his if he brought the thief of the code writing, dead or alive, to his employer. He was half inclined to jump off again now before it was too late, but looking down he saw they were already speeding over a network of tracks, and trains were flying by in every direction. By the time they were out of this, the speed would be too great for him to attempt a jump. It was even now risky, and he was heavy for athletics. He must do it at once if he did it at all. He looked ahead tentatively to see if the track on which he must jump was clear, and the great eye of an engine stabbed him in the face as it bore down upon him. The next instant it swept by, its hot breath fanning his cheek, and he drew back, shuddering involuntarily. It was of no use. He could not jump here. Perhaps they would slow up or stop, and anyway, should he jump or stay on board? He sat down on the upper step, the better to get the situation in hand. Perhaps in a minute more the way would be clearer to jump off if he decided not to go on. Thus he vacillated. It was rather unlike him not to know his own mind. It seemed as if there must be something here to follow, and yet perhaps he was mistaken. He had been the first man of the company at the front door after Mr. Holman turned the paper over, and they all had noticed the absence of the red mark. It had been simultaneous with the clicking of the door latch, and he had covered the ground from his seat to the door sooner than anyone else. He could swear he had seen the man get into the cab that stood almost in front of the house. He had lost no time in getting into his own car, which was detailed for such an emergency, and in signaling the officer on a motorcycle, who was also ready for a quick call. The carriage had barely turned the corner when they followed. There was no other of the kind in sight either way but that, and he had followed it closely. It must have been the right carriage, and yet, when the man got out at the church, he was changed, much changed in appearance, so that he had looked twice into the empty carriage to make sure that the man for whom he searched was not still in there hiding. Then he had followed him into the church and seen him married, stood close at hand when he put his bride into a big car, and he had followed the car to the house where the reception was held, even mingling with the guests and watching until the bridal couple left for the train. He had stood in the alley in the shadow, the only one of the guests who had found how the bride was really going away, and again he had followed to the station. He had walked close enough to the bridegroom in the station to be almost sure that mustache and those heavy eyebrows were false, and yet he could not make it out. How could it be possible that a man who was going to be married in a great church full of fashionable people would so dare to flirt with chance as to accept an invitation to a dinner where he might not be able to get away for hours? What would have happened if he had not got there in time? Was it in the least possible that these two men could be identical? Everything but the likeness and the fact that he had followed the man so closely pointed out the impossibility. The thick-set man was accustomed to trust his inner impressions thoroughly, and in this case his inner impression was that he must watch this peculiar bridegroom and be sure he was not the right man before he forever got away from him. And yet he might be missing the right man by doing it. However, he had come so far, had risked a good deal already in following and in throwing himself on that fast-moving train. He would stay a little longer and find out for sure. He would try and get a seat where he could watch him, and in an hour he ought to be able to tell if he were really the man who had stolen the code writing. If he could avoid the conductor for a time, he would simply profess to have taken the wrong train by mistake, and maybe could get put off somewhere near home, in case he discovered that he was barking up the wrong tree. He would stick to the train for a little yet, inasmuch as there seemed no safe way of getting off at present. Having decided so much, He gave one last glance toward the twinkling lights of the city hurrying past, and getting up, sauntered into the train, keeping a weather eye out for the conductor. He meant to burn no bridges behind him. He was well provided with money for any kind of a trip, and mileage books and passes. He knew where to send a telegram that would bring him instant assistance in case of need, and even now he knew the officer on the motorcycle had reported to his employer that he had boarded this train. There was really no immediate need for him to worry. It was big game he was after, and one must take some risks in a case of that sort. Thus he entered the sleeper to make good the impression of his inner senses. Gordon had never held anything so precious, so sweet and beautiful and frail looking, in his arms. He had a feeling that he ought to lay her down, yet there was a longing to draw her closer to himself and shield her from everything that could trouble her. But she was not his, only a precious trust to be guarded and cared for as vigilantly as the message he carried hidden about his neck. She belonged to another, somewhere, and was a sacred trust until circumstances made it possible for him to return her to her rightful husband. Just what all this might mean to himself, to the woman in his arms, and to the man whom she was to have married, Gordon had not as yet had time to think. It was as if he had been watching a moving picture, and suddenly a lot of circumstances had fallen in a heap, and become all jumbled up together, the result of his own rash but unsuspecting steps, the way whole families have in moving pictures of falling through a skyscraper from floor to floor, carrying furniture and inhabitants with them as they descend. He had not as yet been able to disentangle himself from the debris and find out what had been his fault, and what he ought to do about it. He laid her gently on the couch of the drawing room, and opened the little door of the private dressing room. There would be cold water in there. He knew very little about caring for sick people. He had always been well and strong himself, but cold water was what they used for people who had fainted, he was sure. He would not call in anyone to help unless it was absolutely necessary. He pulled the door of the stateroom shut and went after the water. As he passed the mirror, he started at the curious vision of himself. One false eyebrow had come loose and was hanging over his eye, and his goatee was crooked. Had it been so all the time? He snatched the eyebrow off and then the other, but the mustache and goatee were more tightly affixed, and it was very painful to remove them. He glanced back, and the white, limp look of the girl on the couch frightened him. What was he about, to stop over his appearance when she might be dying? And as for pain, he tore the false hair roughly from him, and, stuffing it into his pocket, filled a glass with water and went back to the couch. His chin and upper lip smarted, but he did not notice it, nor know that the mark of the plaster was all about his face. He only knew that she lay there apparently lifeless before him, and he must bring the soul back into those dear eyes. It was strange, wonderful how his feeling had grown for the girl whom he had never seen till 3 hours before. He held the glass to her white lips and tried to make her drink, then poured water on his handkerchief and awkwardly bathed her forehead. Some hairpins slipped loose, and a great wealth of golden brown hair fell across his knees as he half knelt beside her. One little hand drooped over the side of the couch and touched his. He started. It seemed so soft and cold and lifeless. He blamed himself that he had no remedies in his suitcase. Why had he never thought to carry something? A simple restorative. Other people might need it, though he did not. No man ought to travel without something for the saving of life in an emergency. He might have needed it himself, even, in case of a railroad accident or something. He slipped his arm tenderly under her head and tried to raise it so that she could drink, but the white lips did not move, nor attempt to swallow. Then a panic seized him. Suppose she was dying? Not until later, when he had quiet and opportunity for thought, did it occur to him what a terrible responsibility he had dared to take upon himself in letting her people leave her with him. What a fearful position he would have been in if she had really died. At the moment his whole thought was one of anguish at the idea of losing her, anxiety to save her precious life, and not for himself. Forgetting his own need of quiet and obscurity, He laid her gently back upon the couch again, and rushed from the stateroom out into the aisle of the sleeper. The conductor was just making his rounds, and he hurried to him with a white face. " Is there a doctor on board, or have you any restoratives? There is a lady " He hesitated, and the color rolled freshly into his anxious face. " That is, my wife " He spoke the word unwillingly, having at the instant of speaking realized that he must say this to protect her good name. It seemed like uttering a falsehood, or stealing another man's property, and yet technically it was true, and, for her sake at least, he must acknowledge it. " My wife," he began again more connectedly, " is ill, unconscious." The conductor looked at him sharply. He had sized them up as a wedding party when they came down the platform toward the train. The young man's blush confirmed his supposition. " I'll see," he said briefly. " Go back to her, and I'll bring some one." It was just as Gordon turned back that the thick set man entered the car from the other end and met him face to face. But Gordon was too distraught at that moment to notice him, for his mind was at rest about his pursuer as soon as the train started. Not so with the pursuer, however. His keen little eyes took in the white, anxious face, the smear of sticking plaster about the mouth and eyebrows, and instantly knew his man. His instincts had not failed him after all. He put out a pair of brawny fists to catch at him, but a lurch of the train and Gordon's swift stride outpurposed him, and by the time the little man had righted his footing, Gordon was disappearing into the stateroom, and the conductor with another man was in the aisle behind him waiting to pass. He stepped back and watched. At least he had driven his prey to quarry, and there was no possible escape now until the train stopped. He would watch that door as a cat watches a mouse, and perhaps be able to send a telegram for help before he made any move at all. It was as well that his impulse to take the man then and there had come to naught. What would the other passengers have thought of him? He must, of course, move cautiously. What a blunder he had almost made! It was no part of his purpose to make public his errand. The men who were behind him did not wish to be known, nor to have their business known. With narrowing eyes he watched the door of the stateroom as the conductor and doctor came and went. He gathered from a few questions asked by one of the passengers that there was someone sick, probably the lady he had seen faint as the train started. It occurred to him that this might be his opportunity, and when the conductor came out of the drawing room the second time he inquired if any assistance was needed, and implied that doctoring was his profession, though it would be a sorry patient that had only his attention. However, if he had one accomplishment it was bluffing, and he never stopped at any profession that suited his needs. The conductor was annoyed at the interruptions that had already occurred, and he answered him brusquely that they had all the help necessary and there wasn't anything the matter anyway. There was nothing left for the man to do but wait. He subsided with his eye on the stateroom door, and later secured a berth in plain sight of that door, but gave no order to have it made up until every other passenger in the car was gone to what rest a sleeping car provides. He kept his vigil well, but was rewarded with no sight of his prey that night, and at last with a sense of duty well done, and the comfortable promise from the conductor that his deftly worded telegraphic message to Mr. Holman should be sent from a station they passed a little after midnight, he crept to his well-earned rest. He was not at home in a dress shirt and collar, being of the walks of life where a collar is mostly accounted superfluous, and he was glad to be relieved of it for a few hours. It had not yet occurred to him that his appearance in that evening suit would be a trifle out of place when morning came. It is doubtful if he had ever considered matters of dress. His profession was that of a human ferret of the lower order, and there were many things he did not know. It might have been the way he held his fork at dinner that had made Gordon decide that he was but a henchman of the others. Having put his mind and his body at rest, he proceeded to sleep, and the train thundered on its way into the night. Gordon, meanwhile, had hurried back from his appeal to the conductor, and stood looking helplessly down at the delicate girl as she lay there so white and seemingly lifeless. Her pretty travelling gown set off the exquisite face finely. Her glorious hair seemed to crown her. A handsome hat had fallen unheeded to the floor, and lay rolling back and forth in the aisle with the motion of the train. He picked it up reverently, as though it had been a part of her. His face in the few minutes had gone haggard. The conductor hurried in presently, followed by a grave, elderly man with a professional air. He touched a practised finger to the limp wrist, looked closely into the face, and then, taking a little bottle from a case he carried, called for a glass. The liquid was poured between the closed lips. The white throat reluctantly swallowed it. The eyelids presently fluttered. A long breath, that was scarcely more than a sigh, hovered between the lips, and then the blue eyes opened. She looked about, bewildered, looking longest at Gordon, then closed her eyes wearily, as if she wished they had not brought her back, and lay still. The physician still knelt beside her, and Gordon, with time now to think, began to reflect on the possible consequences of his deeds. With anxious face he stood watching, reflecting bitterly that he might not claim even a look of recognition from those sweet eyes, and wishing with all his heart that his marriage had been genuine. A passing memory of his morning ride to New York in company with Miss Bentley's conjured vision brought wonder to his eyes. It all seemed so long ago, and so strange that he ever could have entertained for a moment the thought of marrying Julia. She was a good girl, of course, fine and handsome and all that, but... And here his eyes sought the sweet, sad face on the couch, and his heart suffered in a real agony for the trouble he saw, and for the trouble he must yet give to her when he told her who he was, or rather who he was not, for he must tell her, and that soon. It would not do to go on in her company, nor to Chicago, and yet how was he possibly to leave her in this condition? But no revelations were to be given that night. The physician administered another draught, and ordered the porter to make up the berth immediately. Then, with skilful hands and strong arms, he laid the young girl in upon the pillows, and made her comfortable. Gordon, meanwhile, standing awkwardly by with averted eyes and troubled mien. He would have liked to help, but he did not know how. "She had better not be disturbed any more than is necessary to night," said the doctor, as he pulled the pretty cloth travelling gown smoothly down about the girl's ankles and patted it with professional hands. "Don't let her yield to any nonsense about putting up her hair or taking off that frock for fear she'll rumple it. She needs to lie perfectly quiet. It is a case of utter exhaustion, and I should say a long strain of some kind. Anxiety, worry, perhaps." He looked keenly at the sheepish bridegroom. "Has she had any trouble?" Gordon lifted honest eyes. "I'm afraid so," he answered contritely, as if it must have been his fault some way. "Well, don't let her have any more," said the elder man briskly. "She's a very fragile bit of womanhood, young man, and you'll have to handle her carefully or she'll blow away. Make her happy, young man. People can't have too much happiness in this world. It is the best thing, after all, to keep them well. Don't be afraid to give her plenty." "Thank you," said Gordon fervently, wishing it were in his power to do what the physician ordered. The kindly physician, the assiduous porter, and the brusque but good-hearted conductor went away at last, and Gordon was left with his precious charge, who to all appearances was sleeping quietly. The light was turned low, and the curtains of the berth were a little apart. He could see the dim outline of drapery about her, and one shadowy hand lying limp at the edge of the couch in weary relaxation. Above her in the upper berth, which he had told the porter not to make up, lay the great purple-black plumed hat, and a sheaf of lilies of the valley from her bouquet. It seemed all so strange for him to be there in their sacred presence. He locked the door so that no one should disturb the sleeper, and went slowly into the little private dressing room. For a full minute after he reached it, he stood looking into the mirror before him, looking at his own weary, soiled face, and wondering if he, Cyril Gordon, heretofore honored and self-respecting, had really done in the last 12 hours all the things which he was crediting himself with having done. And the question was, how had it happened? Had he taken leave of his senses, or had circumstances been too much for him? Had he lost the power of judging between right and wrong? Could he have helped any of the things that had come upon him? How could he have helped them? What ought he to have done? What ought he to do now? Was he a criminal beyond redemption? Had he spoiled the life of the sweet woman out there in her berth? Or could he somehow make amends for what he had done? And was he as badly to blame for it all as he felt himself to be? After a minute he rallied, to realize that his face was dirty. He washed the marks of the adhesive plaster away, and then, not satisfied with the result, he brought his shaving things from his suitcase and shaved. Somehow he felt more like himself after his toilet was completed, and he slipped back into the darkened drawing room and stretched himself wearily on the couch, which, according to his directions, was not made up, but merely furnished with pillows and a blanket. The night settled into the noisy quiet of an express train, and each revolution of the wheels as they whirled their way Chicago-ward resolved itself into the old refrain, "Don't let anything hinder you. Don't let anything hinder you." He certainly was not taking the most direct route from New York to Washington, though it might eventually prove that the longest way round was the shortest way home, on account of its comparative safety. As he settled to the quiet of his couch, a number of things came more clearly to his vision. One was that they had safely passed the outskirts of New York without interference of any kind, and must by this time be speeding toward Albany, unless they were on a road that took them more directly west. He had not thought to look at the tickets for knowledge of his bearings, and the light was too dim for him to make out any monograms or letterings on inlaid wood panels or transoms, even if he had known enough about New York railroads to gain information from them. There was one thing certain. Even if he had been mistaken about his supposed pursuers, by morning there would surely be someone searching for him. The duped Holman combination would stop at nothing when they discovered his theft of the paper, and he could not hope that so sharp-eyed a man as Mr. Holman had seemed to be would be long in discovering the absence of his private mark on the paper. Undoubtedly he knew it already. As for the frantic bridegroom, Gordon dreaded the thought of meeting him. It must be put off at any hazards until the message was safe with his chief. Then, if he had to answer with his life for carrying off another man's bride, he could at least feel that he had left no duty to his government undone. It was plain that his present situation was a dangerous one from two points of view, for the bridegroom would have no difficulty in finding out what train he and the lady had taken, and he was satisfied that an emissary of Holman had more than a suspicion of his identity. The obvious thing to do was to get off that train at the first opportunity and get across country to another line of railroad. But how was that to be done with a sick lady on his hands? Of course he could leave her to herself. She probably had taken journeys before and would know how to get back. She would at least be able to telegraph to her friends to come for her. He could leave her money and a note explaining his involuntary villainy, and her indignation with him would probably be a sufficient stimulant to keep her from dying of chagrin at her plight. But as from the first, every nerve and fibre in him rejected this suggestion. It would be cowardly, unmanly, horrible. Undoubtedly it might be the wise thing to do from many standpoints, but never! He could no more leave her that way than he could run off to save his life and leave that message he carried. She was a trust as much as that. He had got into this, and he must get out somehow, but he would not desert the lady or neglect his duty. Toward morning, when his fitful vigil became less lucid, it occurred to him that he ought really to have deserted the bride while she was still unconscious, jumping off the train at the short stop they had made soon after she fell into his arms. She would then have been cared for by someone, his absence discovered, and she would have been put off the train and her friends sent for at once. But it would have been dastardly to have deserted her that way, not knowing even if she still lived, he on whom she had at least a claim of temporary protection. It was all a terrible muddle, right and wrong, juggled in such a mysterious and unusual way. He never remembered to have come to a spot before where it was difficult to know which of two things it was right to do. There had always before been such clearly defined divisions. He had supposed that people who professed not to know what was right were people who wished to be blinded on the subject because they wished to do wrong and think it right. But now he saw that he had judged such too harshly. Perhaps his brain had been overstrained with the excitement and annoyances of the day, and he was not quite in a condition to judge what was right. He ought to snatch a few minutes' sleep, and then his mind would be clearer, for something must be done, and that soon. It would not do to risk entering a large city where detectives and officers with full particulars might even now be on the watch for him. He was too familiar with the workings of retribution in this progressive age not to know his danger. But he really must get some sleep. At last he yielded to the drowsiness that was stealing over him. Just for a moment, he thought, and the wheels hummed on their monotonous song. Don't let anything hinder. Don't let anything. Don't hinder. End of chapter 7. Best Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail Mattern. The Best Man by Grace Livingston Hill. Chapter 8. The man slept, and the train rushed on. The night waned. The dawn grew purple in the east, and streaked itself with gold. Then later got out a fillet of crimson, and drew over its cloudy forehead. The breath of the lilies filled the little room with delicate fragrance, and mingled strange scenes in the dreams of the man and the woman so strangely united. The sad little bride grew restless and stirred, but the man on the couch did not hear her. He was dreaming of a shooting affray, in which he carried a bride in a gold pencil, and was shot for stealing a sandwich out of Mr. Holman's vest pocket. The morning light grew clearer. The east had put on a vesture of gold above her purple robe, and its reflection shone softly in at the window, for the train was just at that moment rushing northward, though its general course was west. The sleeper behind the thick green curtains stirred again, and became conscious, as in many days past, of her heavy burden of sorrow. Always at first waking, the realization of it sat upon her as though it would crush the life from her body. Lying still with bated breath, she fought back waking consciousness as she had learned to do in the last 3 months, yet knew it to be futile while she was doing it. The sun shot up between the bars of crimson, like a topaz on a lady's gown that crowns the whole beautiful costume. The piercing, jeweled light lay across the white face, touched the lips with warm fingers, and the troubled soul knew all that had passed. She lay quiet, letting the torrent sweep over her with its sickening realization. She was married. It was over, with the painful parting from dear ones. She was off away from them all. The new life she so dreaded had begun. And how was she to face it? The life with one whom she feared and did not respect. How could she ever have done it but for the love of her dear ones? Gradually she came to remember the night before, the parting with her mother and her brother, the little things that brought the tears again to her eyes. Then all was blankness. She must have fainted. She did not often faint, but it must be. Yes, she remembered opening her eyes and seeing men's faces about her, and George, could it have been George, with a kinder look in his eyes than she had ever thought to see there. Then she must have fainted again, or had she? No, someone had lifted her into this berth, and she had drunk something and had gone to sleep. What had happened? Where was everybody? It was good to have been left alone. She grudgingly gave her unloved husband a fragment of gratitude for not having tried to talk to her. In the carriage on the way he had seemed determined to begin a long argument of some kind. She did not want to argue any more. She had written tomes upon the subject, and had said all she had to say. He was not deceived. He knew she did not love him, and would never have married him but for her mother's sake, and for the sake of her beloved father's memory. What was the use of saying more? Let it rest. The deed was done, and they were married. Now let him have his way and make her suffer as he chose. If he would but let her suffer in silence, and not inflict his bitter tongue upon her, she would try to bear it. And perhaps, oh, perhaps she would not live long, and it would soon be all over. As the daylight grew, the girl felt an inclination to find out whether her husband was near. Cautiously she lifted her head, and, drawing back a corner of the curtain, peered out. He lay quietly on the couch, one hand under his cheek against the pillow, the other across his breast, as if to guard something. He was in the still sleep of the over-wearied. He scarcely seemed to be breathing. Celia dropped the curtain and put her hand to her throat. It startled her to find him so near and so still. Softly, stealthily, she lay down again and closed her eyes. She must not waken him. She would have as long a time to herself as was possible, and tried to think of her dear mother and her precious brother. Oh, if she were just going away from them alone, how well she could bear it! But to be going with one whom she had always almost hated. Her brother's happy words about George suddenly came to her mind. Jefferson had thought him fine. Well, of course, the dear boy knew nothing about it. He had not read all those letters, those awful letters. He did not know the threats, the terrible language that had been used. She shuddered as she thought of it. But in the same breath she was glad that her brother had been deceived. She would not have it otherwise. Her dear ones must never know what she had gone through to save them from disgrace and loss of fortune. Disgrace, of course, being the first and greatest. She had feared that George would let them see through his veneer of manners and leave them troubled. But he had made a better appearance than she had hoped. 10 years had made a greater change in him than she had expected. He really had not been so bad as her conjured image of him. Then a sudden desire to look at him again seized her, to know, once for all, just how he really did seem. She would not want to notice him awake any more than she could help, nor dare lest he presume upon her sudden interest to act as if he had never offended. But if she should look at him now as he lay asleep, she might study his face and see what she really had to expect. She fought the desire to peer at him again, but finally it gained complete possession of her, and she drew back the curtain once more. He was lying just as quietly as before. His heavy hair, a little disordered on the pillow, gave him a noble, interesting appearance. He did not seem at all a fellow of whom to be afraid. It was incredible that he could have written those letters. She tried to trace in his features a likeness to the youth of 10 years ago, whom she had known when she was but a little girl, who had tied her braids to her chair, and put raw oysters and caterpillars down her back, or stretched invisible cords to trip her feet in dark places, who made her visits to a beloved uncle, whom he also had the right to call uncle, though he was no cousin of hers, a long list of catastrophes resulting in tears, who had never failed to mortify her on all occasions possible, and once... But the memories were too horrible as they crowded one upon another. Let them be forgotten. She watched the face before her keenly, critically, yet she could see no trace of any such character as she had imagined the boy George must have developed as a man, of which his letters had given her ample proof. This man's face was finely cut and sensitive. There was nothing coarse or selfish in its lines. The long, dark eyelashes lay above dark circles of weariness, and gave that look of boyishness that always touches the maternal chord in a woman's heart. George used to have a puffy, self-indulgent look under his eyes, even when he was a boy. She had imagined from his last photograph that he would be much stouter, much more bombastic. But then, in his sleep, perhaps those things fell from a man. She tried to turn away indifferently, but something in his face held her. She studied it. If he had been any other man, any stranger, she would have said from looking at him critically that kindness and generosity, self-respect and respect for women, were written all over the face before her. There was fine, firm modeling about the lips and the clean-shaven chin, and about the forehead the look almost of a scholar. Yet she thought she knew the man before her to be none of those things. How deceptive were looks! She would probably be envied rather than pitied by all who saw her. Well, Perhaps that was better. She could the easier keep her trouble to herself. But stay, what was there about this man that seemed different? The smooth face? Yes. She had the dim impression that last night he wore a mustache. She must have been mistaken, of course. She had only looked at him when absolutely necessary, and her brain was in such a whirl. But still, there seemed to be something different about him. Her eyes wandered to the hand that lay across his breast. It was the fine, white hand of the professional man, the kind of hand that somehow attracts the eye with a sense of cleanness and strength. There was nothing flabby about it. George, as a boy, used to have big stumpy fingers and nails chewed down to the quick. She could remember how she used to hate to look at them when she was a little girl, and yet somehow could not keep her eyes away. She saw with relief that the nails on this hand were well shaped and well cared for. He looked very handsome and attractive as he lay there. The sun shot one of its early, daring bolts of light across his hair as the train turned in its course and lurched northward around a curve. It glinted there for a moment, like a miniature searchlight, traveling over the head, showing up every wave and curve. He had the kind of hair which makes a woman's hand instinctively long to touch it. Celia wondered at the curious thoughts that crowded through her mind, knowing that all the while there was the consciousness that when this man should wake she would think of nothing but his hateful personality as she had known it through the years. And she was his wife! How strange! How terrible! How impossible to live with the thought through interminable, weary years! Oh, that she might die at once, before her strength failed and her mother found out her sorrow. She lay back again on her pillows very still, and tried to think, but somehow a pleasant image of him, her husband, lingered in her memory. Could it be possible that she would ever see anything pleasant in him? Ever endure the days of his companionship? Ever come to the point where she could overlook his outrageous conduct toward her, forgive him, and be even tolerant of him? Sharp memories crowded upon her, and the smarting tears stung their way into her eyes, answering and echoing in her heart. No, no, 1,000 times no. She had paid his price and gained redemption for her own, but forget what he had done? Never. The long strain of weariness and the monotony of the onrushing train lulled her half into unconsciousness again, and the man on the couch slumbered on. He came to himself suddenly, with all his senses on the alert, as the thumping noise and motion of the train ceased, and a sudden silence of open country succeeded, broken now and again by distant oncoming and receding voices. He caught the fragment of a sentence from some train official. "It's a half-hour late, and maybe more. We'll just have to lie by, that's all. Here, you, Jim, take this flag and run up to the switch." The voice trailed into the distance, ended by the metallic note of a hammer doing something mysterious to the underpinning of the car. Gordon sat up suddenly, his hand yet across his breast, where his first waking thought had been to feel if the little pencil case were safe. Glancing stealthily toward the curtains of the berth, and perceiving no motion, he concluded that the girl still slept. Softly he slipped his feet into his shoes, gave 1 or 2 other touches to his toilet, and stood up, looking toward the curtains. He wanted to go out and see where they were stopping, but dared he go without knowing that she was all right? Softly, reverently, he stooped and brought his face close to the opening in the curtains. Celia felt his eyes upon her. Her own were closed, and by a superhuman effort she controlled her breathing, slowly, gently, as if she were asleep. He looked for a long moment, thrilled by the delicate beauty of her sleeping face, filled with an intoxicating joy to see that her lips were no longer white. Then, turning reverently away, he unlocked the door and stepped forth. The other occupants of the car were still wrapped in slumber. Loud snores of various kinds and qualities testified to that. A dim light at the further end contended luridly and losingly with the daylight now flooding the outside world and creeping mischievously into the transoms. Gordon closed the door of the compartment noiselessly and went down the aisle to the end of the car. A door was open, and he could hear voices outside. The conductor stood talking with 2 brakemen. He heard the words, 3/4 of an hour at least. And then the men walked off toward the engine. Gordon looked across the country, and for the first time since he started on his journey, let himself remember that it was springtime and May. There had been a bitter wind the night before, with a hint of rain in the air. In fact, it had rained quite smartly during the ride to the hospital with the hurt child. But he had been so perturbed that he had taken little notice of the weather. But this was a radiant morning. The sun was in one of its most charming moods, when it touches everything with a sort of unnatural glory after the long winter of darkness and cold. Every tree trunk in the distance seemed to stand out clearly. Every little grass blade was set with a glowing jewel, and the winding stream across a narrow valley fairly blazed with brightness. The very road with its deep, clean wheel grooves seemed like a well-taken photograph. The air had an alluring softness mingled with its tang of winter that made one long to take a walk anywhere out into the world, just for the joy of being and doing. A meadowlark shot up from somewhere to a telegraph pole, let go a blithe note, and hurried on. It was glorious. The exhilaration filled Gordon's blood. And here was the chance he craved to slip away from the train before it reached a place where he could be discovered. If he had but thought to bring his suitcase, he could slip back now without being noticed and get it. He could even go without it. But he could not leave her that way, could he? Ought he? Perhaps he ought. But it would not do to leave his suitcase with her, for it contained letters addressed to his real name. An explanation would of course be demanded, and he could never satisfy a loving mother and brother for having left a helpless girl in such a situation, even if he could satisfy his own conscience, which he knew he never could. He simply could not leave her, and yet he must get away from that train as soon as possible. Perhaps this was the only opportunity he would have before reaching Buffalo, and it was very risky, indeed dangerous, to dare enter Buffalo. It was a foregone conclusion that there would be private detectives ready to meet the train in Buffalo with full descriptions and particulars, and only too ready to make way with him if they could do so without being found out. He looked nervously back at the door of the car. Dared he attempt to waken her and say that they had made a mistake and must change cars? Was she well enough? And where could they go? He looked off toward the landscape for an answer to his question. They were decidedly in the country. The train stood at the top of a high embankment of cinders, below which was a smooth country road running parallel to the railroad for some distance, till it met another road at right angles to it, which stretched away between thrifty meadowlands to a nestling village. The glorified stream he had first noticed far up the valley glinted narrower here in the morning light, with a suggestion of watercress and forget-me-nots in its fringes as it veered away under a bridge toward the village and hid itself in a tangle of willows and cattails. How easy it would be to slide down that embankment and walk out that road over the bridge to the village, where of course a conveyance of some sort could be hired to bear him to another railroad town, and thence to Pittsburgh, perhaps, where he could easily get a train to Washington. How easy, if only he were not held by some invisible hands to care for the sweet sleeper inside the car. And yet, for her sake as well as his own, he must do something, and that right speedily. He was standing thus in deep meditation, looking off at the little village which seemed so near and yet would be so far for her to walk, when he was pervaded with that strange sense of someone near. For an instant he resisted the desire to lift his eyes and prove to himself that no one was present in a doorway, which a moment before he knew had been unoccupied. Then, frowning at his own nervousness, he turned. She stood there in all the beauty of her fresh young girlhood, a delicate pallor on her cheeks, and a deep sadness in her great dark eyes, which were fixed upon him intently in a sort of puzzled study. She was fully dressed, even to her hat and gloves. Every wave of her golden hair lay exquisitely in place under the purple hat, as though she might have taken an hour or two at her toilet. Yet she had made it with excited haste and with trembling fingers, determined to have it accomplished before the return of her dreaded liege lord. She had sprung from her berth the instant he closed the door upon her, and fastened the little catch to bar him out. She had dashed cold water into her face, fastened her garments hurriedly, and tossed the glory of her hair into place with a few touches and what hairpins she could find on the floor. Then, putting on her hat, coat, and gloves, she had followed him into the outer air. She had a feeling that she must have air to breathe or she would suffocate. A wild desire filled her to go alone into the great out of doors. Oh, if she but dared to run away from him! But that she might not do, for all his threats would then probably be made good by him upon her dear mother and brother. No, she must be patient and bear to the end all that was set down for her. But she would get out and breathe a little before he returned. He had very likely gone into the smoker. She remembered that the George of old had been an inveterate smoker of cigarettes. She would have time for a taste of the morning while he had his smoke, and if he returned and found her gone, what mattered it? The inevitable beginning of conversations, which she so dreaded, would be put off for a time. She never thought to come upon him standing thus alone, looking off at the beauty of the morning as if he enjoyed it. The sight of him held her still, watching, as his sleeping face had held her gaze earlier in the morning. How different he was from what she had expected! How the 10 years had changed him! One could almost fancy it might have changed his spirit also, but for those letters, those terrible letters. The writer of those letters could not change except for the worse. And yet he was handsome, intellectual looking, kindly in his bearing, appreciative of the beauty about him. She could not deny it. It was most astonishing. He had lost that baggy look under his eyes, and the weak, selfish, cruel pout of lip she remembered so keenly. Then he turned, and a smile of delight and welcome lit up his face. In spite of herself, she could not keep an answering smile from glimmering faintly in her own. "What? You up and out here?" he said, hastening closer to the step. "How are you feeling this morning? Better, I'm sure, or you would not be here so early." "Oh, I had to get out to the air," she said. "I couldn't stay in the car another minute. I wish we could walk the rest of the way." "Do you?" he said with a quick, surprised appreciation in his voice. "I was just wishing something like that myself. Do you see that beautiful straight road down there? I was longing to slide down this bank and walk over to that little village for breakfast. Then we could get an auto, perhaps, or a carriage, to take us on to another train. If you hadn't been so ill last night, I might have proposed it." "Could we?" she asked earnestly. "I should like it so much." And there was eagerness in her voice. What a lovely morning! Her eyes were wistful, like the eyes of those who weep and wonder why they may not laugh, since sunshine is still yellow. "Of course we could," he said, "if you were only able." "Oh, I'm able enough. I should much rather do that than to go back into that stuffy car. But wouldn't they think it awfully queer of us to run away from the train this way?" "They needn't know anything about it," he declared, like a boy about to play truant. "I'll slip back in the car and get our suitcases. Is there anything of yours I might be in danger of leaving behind?" "No, I put everything in my suitcase before I came out," she said listlessly, although she had already lost her desire to go. "I am afraid you are not able," he said, pausing solicitously as he scaled the steps. She was surprised at his interest in her welfare. "Why, of course I am," she said insistently. "I have often taken longer walks than that looks to be, and I shall feel much better for being out. I really feel as if I couldn't stand it any longer in there." "Good. Then we'll try it." He hurried in for the baggage, and left her standing on the cinder roadbed beside the train, looking off at the opening morning. Chapter 9 of The Best Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail Mattern. The Best Man by Grace Livingston Hill. Chapter 9. It was just at that instant that the thick-set man in his berth, not 10 feet away, became broadly conscious of the unwonted stillness of the train and the cessation of motion that had lulled him to such sound repose. So does a tiny, sharp sound strike upon our senses and bring them into life again from sleep, making us aware of a state of things that has been going on for some time, perhaps without our realization. The sound that roused him may have been the click of the stateroom latch as Gordon opened the door. The shades were down in the man's berth, and the curtains drawn close. The daylight had not as yet penetrated through their thickness, but once awake his senses were immediately on the alert. He yawned, stretched, and suddenly arrested another yawn to analyze the utter stillness all about him. A sonorous snore suddenly emphasized the quiet of the car, and made him aware of all the occupants of all those curtained apartments. His mind went over a quick resume of the night before, and detailed him at once to duty. Another soft clicking of the latch set him to listening, and his bristly, shocked head was stuck instantly out between the curtains into the aisle, eyes toward the stateroom door, just in time to see that a man was stealing quietly down the passageway out of the end door, carrying 2 suitcases and an umbrella. It was his man. He was sure instantly, and his mind grew frantic with the thought. Almost he had outdone himself through foolish sleep. He half sprang from his berth, then remembered that he was but partly dressed, and jerked back quickly to grab his clothes, stopping in the operation of putting them on to yank up his window shade with an impatient click and flatten his face against the window pane. Yes, they were down on the ground outside the train, both of them, man, woman, baggage, and all, slipping away from him while he slept peacefully and let them go. The language of his mind at that point was hot with invectives. Gordon had made his way back to the girl's side without meeting any porters or wakeful fellow passengers. But a distant rumbling greeted his ears. The waited-for express was coming. If they were to get away, it must be done at once, or their flight would be discovered, and perhaps even prevented. It certainly was better not to have it known where they got off. He had taken the precaution to close the stateroom door behind him, and so it might be some time before their absence would be discovered. Perhaps there would be other stops before the train reached Buffalo, in which case their track would not easily be followed. He had no idea that the evil eye of his pursuer was even then upon him. Celia was already on the ground, looking off toward the little village wistfully. Just how it was to make her lot any brighter to get out of the train and run away to a strange little village she did not quite explain to herself, but it seemed to be a relief to her pent-up feelings. She was half afraid that George might raise some new objection when he returned. Gordon swung himself down on the cinder path, scanning the track either way. The conductor and brakeman were not in sight. Far in the distance a black speck was rushing down upon them. Gordon could hear the vibration of the rail of the second track, upon which he placed his foot as he helped Celia across. In a moment more the train would pass. It was important that they should be down the embankment out of sight. Would the delicate girl not be afraid of the steep incline? She hesitated for just an instant at the top, for it was very steep. Then, looking up at him, she saw that he expected her to go down with him. She gave a little frightened gasp, set her lips, and started. He held her as well as he could with 2 suitcases and an umbrella clutched in his other hand, and finally, as the grade grew steeper, he let go the baggage altogether, and it slid briskly down by itself, while he devoted himself to steadying the girl's now inevitable and swift descent. It certainly was not an ideal way of traveling, this new style of gravity road, but it landed them without delay, though much shaken and scratched, and divested of every vestige of dignity. It was impossible not to laugh, and Celia's voice rang out merrily, showing that she had not always wept and looked sorrowful. "Are you much hurt?" asked Gordon anxiously, holding her hands and looking down at her tenderly. Before she could reply, the express train roared above them, drowning their voices in laughter, and when it was past, they saw their own train take up its interrupted way grumblingly and rapidly move off. If the passengers on those 2 trains had not been deeply wrapped in slumber, they might have been surprised to see 2 fashionably attired young persons, with hats awry and clasped hands, laughing in a country road at 5 o'clock of a May morning. But only one was awake, and by the time the 2 in the road below remembered to look up and take notice, the trains were rapidly disappearing. The girl had been deeply impressed with Gordon's solicitude for her. It was so out of keeping with his letters. He had never seemed to care whether she suffered or not. In all the arrangements he had said what he wanted, indeed what he would have, with an implied threat in the framing of his sentence in case she dared demur. Never had there been the least expression of desire for her happiness. Therefore it was something of a surprise to find him so gentle and thoughtful of her. Perhaps, after all, he would not prove so terrible to live with as she had feared. And yet, how could anyone who wrote those letters have any alleviating qualities? It could not be. She must harden herself against him. Still, if he would be outwardly decent to her, it would make her lot easier, of course. But her course of mental reasoning was broken in upon by his stout denunciations of himself. "I ought not to have allowed you to slide down there," he declared. "It was terrible after what you went through last night. I didn't realize how steep and rough it was. Indeed, I didn't. I don't see how you can ever forgive me." "Why, I'm not hurt," she said gently, astonished at his solicitation. There was a strange lump in her throat, brought by his kindness, which threatened tears. Just why should kindness from an unexpected quarter bring tears? "I'm only a little shaken up," she went on, as she saw a real anxiety in his brown eyes. "And I don't mind it in the least. I think it was rather fun, don't you?" A faint glimmer of a smile wavered over the corners of her mouth, and Gordon experienced a sudden desire to take her in his arms and kiss her. It was a strange new feeling. He had never had any such thought about Julia Bentley. "Why, yes, I guess so, if you're sure you're not hurt." "Not a bit," she said, and then for some unexplained reason they both began to laugh. After that they felt better. "If your shoes are as full of these miserable cinders as mine are, they need emptying," declared Gordon, shaking first one well-shod foot and then the other, and looking ruefully at the little velvet boots of the lady. "Suppose you sit down." He looked about for a seat, but the dewy grass was the only resting place visible. He pitched upon the suitcases and improvised a chair. "Now, sit down and let me take them off for you." He knelt in the road at her feet as she obeyed, protesting that she could do it for herself. But he overruled her, and began clumsily to unbutton the tiny buttons, holding the timid little foot firmly, almost reverently, against his knee. He drew the velvet shoe softly off, and turning it upside down, shook out the intruding cinders, put a clumsy finger in to make sure they were all gone, then shyly, tenderly, passed his hand over the sole of the fine silk-stockinged foot that rested so lightly on his knee, to make sure no cinders clung to it. The sight and touch of that little foot stirred him deeply. He had never before been called upon to render service so intimate to any woman, and he did it now with half averted gaze and the utmost respect in his manner. As he did it, he tried to speak about the morning, the departing train, the annoying cinders, anything to make their unusual position seem natural and unstrained. He felt deeply embarrassed, the more so because of his own double part in this queer masquerade. Celia sat watching him, strangely stirred. Her wonder over his kindness grew with each moment, and her prejudices almost dissolved. She could not understand it. There must be something more he wanted of her, for George Hayne had never been kind in the past, unless he wanted something of her. She dreaded lest she should soon find it out. Yet he did not look like a man who was deceiving her. She drew a deep sigh. If only it were true, and he were good and kind, and had never written those awful letters, how good and dear it would be to be tenderly cared for this way. Her lips drooped at the corners, and her eyelids drooped in company with the sigh. Then Gordon looked up in great distress. "You are tired," he declared, pausing in his attempt to fasten the little pearl buttons. "I have been cruel to let you get off the train." "Indeed I'm not," said the girl, brightening with a sudden effort. At least she would not spoil the kindness while it lasted. It was surely better than what she had feared. "You can never button those shoes with your fingers," she laughed, as he redoubled his efforts to capture a tiny disc of pearl and set it into its small velvet socket. "Here, I have a button hook in my handbag. Try this." She produced a small silver instrument from a gold-linked bag on her arm, and handed it to him. He took it helplessly, trying first one end and then the other, and succeeding with neither. "Here, let me show you," she laughed, pulling off one glove. Her white fingers grasped the silver button hook and flashed in and out of the velvet holes, knitting the little shoe to the foot in no time. He watched the process in humble wonder, and she would not have been a human girl not to have been flattered with his interest and admiration. For the minute she forgot who and what he was, and let her laugh ring out merrily, and so with shy audacity he essayed to take off the other shoe. They really felt quite well acquainted, and as if they were going on a day's picnic, when they finally gathered up their belongings and started down the road. Gordon summoned all his ready wit and intellect to brighten the walk for her, though he found himself again and again on the brink of referring to his Washington life, or some other personal matter that would have brought a wondering question to her lips. He had decided that he must not tell her who he was until he could put her in an independent position where she could get away from him at once if she chose. He was bound to look after her until he could place her in good hands, or at least where she could look after herself, and it was better to carry it out leaving her to think what she pleased until he could tell her everything. If all went well, they might be able to catch a Pittsburgh train that night and be in Washington the next day. Then, his message delivered, he would tell her the whole story. Until then he must hold his peace. They went gaily down the road, the girl's pale cheeks beginning to flush with the morning and the exercise. She was not naturally delicate, and her faint the night before had been the result of a series of heavy strains on a heart burdened with terrible fear. The morning and his kindness had made her forget for the time that she was supposed to be walking into a world of dread and sacrifice. "The years at the spring, the days at the morn," quoted Gordon gaily. "Mornings at 7. The hillsides dew pearled." He waved an umbrella off to where a hill flashed back 1,000 lights from its jeweled grass blades thickly set. "The larks on the wing, the snails on the thorn," went on Celia, suddenly catching his spirit and pointing to a lark that darted up into the blue with the trill of the morning in his throat. Gordon turned appreciative eyes upon her. It was good to have her take up his favorite poet in that tone of voice, a tone that showed she too knew and loved Browning. "God's in his heaven. All's right with the world," finished Gordon in a quieter voice, looking straight into her eyes. "That seems very true to-day, doesn't it?" The blue eyes wavered with a hint of shadow in them as they looked back into the brown ones. "Almost, perhaps," she faltered wistfully. The young man wished he dared go behind that "almost perhaps" and find out what she meant, but concluded it were better to bring back the smile and help her to forget for a little while at least. Down by the brook they paused to rest under a weeping willow whose green tinged plumes were dabbling in the brook. Gordon arranged the suitcases for her to sit upon, then climbed down to the brook side and gathered a great bunch of forget-me-nots, blue as her eyes, and brought them to her. She looked at them in wonder. To think they grew out here wild, untended. She had never seen them before, except in pots in the florist's windows. She touched them delicately with the tips of her fingers, as if they were too ethereal for earth, then fastened them in the breast of her gown. "They exactly match your eyes!" he exclaimed involuntarily, and then wished he had not spoken, for she flushed and paled under his glance until he felt he had been unduly bold. He wondered why he had said that. He never had been in the habit of saying pretty things to girls, but this girl somehow called it from him. It was genuine. He sat a moment abashed, not knowing what to say next, as if he were a shy boy, and she did not help him, for her eyelashes drooped in a long, becoming sweep over her cheeks, and she seemed for the moment not to be able to carry off the situation. He was not sure if she were displeased or not. Her heart had thrilled strangely as he spoke, and she was vexed with herself that it should be so. A man who bullied and threatened her for 3 terrible months and forced her to marry him had no right to a thrill of her heart, nor a look from her eyes, be he ever so kind for the moment. He certainly was nice and pleasant when he chose to be. She must watch herself, for never, never must she yield weakly to his smooth overtures. Well did she know him. He had some reason for all this pleasantness. It would surely be revealed soon. She stiffened her lips and tried to look away from him to the purply green hills, but the echo of his words came upon her again, and again her heart thrilled at them. What if, oh, what if he were all right, and she might accept the admiration in his voice. And yet, how could that be possible? The sweet color came into her cheeks again, and the tears flew quickly to her eyes till they looked all sky and dew, and she dared not turn back to him. The silence remained unbroken until a lark in the willow copse behind them burst forth into song and broke the spell that was upon them. "Are you offended at what I said?" he asked earnestly. "I am sorry if you did not like it. The words said themselves without my stopping to think whether you might not like it. Will you forgive me?" "Oh," she said, lifting her forget-me-not eyes to his, "I am not offended. There is nothing to forgive. It was beautiful." Then his eyes spoke the compliment over again, and the thrill started anew in her heart, till her cheeks grew quite rosy, and she buried her face in the coolness of the tiny flowers to hide her confusion. "It was very true," he said in a low, lover-like voice that sounded like a caress. "Oughtn't we to hurry on to catch our train?" said Celia, suddenly springing to her feet. "I'm quite rested now." She felt if she stayed there another moment she would yield to the spell he had cast upon her. With a dull thud of consciousness, the man got himself to his feet and reminded himself that this was another man's promised wife, to whom he had been letting his soul go out. "Don't let anything hinder you. Don't let anything hinder you," suddenly babbled out the little brook, and he gathered up his suitcases and started on. "I am going to carry my suitcase," declared a very decided voice behind him, and a small hand seized hold of its handle. "I beg your pardon, you are not," declared Gordon in a much more determined voice. "But they are too heavy for you, both of them, and the umbrella, too," she protested. "Give me the umbrella, then." But he would not give her even the umbrella, rejoicing in his strength to shield her and bear her burdens. As she walked beside him she remembered vividly a morning when George Hayne had made her carry two heavy baskets that his hands might be free to shoot birds. Could this be the same George Hayne? Altogether it was a happy walk, and far shorter than either had expected it to be, though Gordon worried not a little about his frail companion before they came to the outskirts of the village, and kept begging her to sit down and rest again, but she would not. She was quite eager and excited about the strange village to which they were coming. Its outlying farmhouses were all so clean and white, with green blinds folded placidly over their front windows, and only their back doors astir. The cows all looked peaceful, and the dogs all seemed friendly. They walked up the village street, shaded in patches, with flecks of sunshine through the young leaves. If any one had told Celia Hathaway the night before that she would have walked and talked thus today with her bridegroom, she would have laughed him to scorn. But now, all unconsciously, she had drifted into an attitude of friendliness with the man whom she had thought to hate all the rest of her life. One long, straight, maple-lined street running parallel to the stream comprised the village. They walked to the center of it and still saw no signs of a restaurant. A post office, a couple of stores, and a bakery made up the business portion of the town, and upon enquiry it appeared that there was no public eating house, the one hotel of the place having been sold at auction the week before on account of the death of the owner. The early village loungers stared disinterestedly at the phenomenal appearance in their midst of a couple of city folks with their luggage, and no apparent means of transit except their two delicately shod feet. It presented a problem too grave to be solved unassisted, and there were solemn shakings of the head over them. At last one who had discouragingly stated the village lack of a public inn asked casually, "Had a runaway?" "Oh, no," laughed Gordon pleasantly. "We didn't travel with horses." "Had a puncture, then," announced the village wiseacre, shifting from one foot to the other. "Well, you come the wrong direction to get help," said another languid listener. "There ain't no garage here. The feller what used to keep it skipped out with Sam Galt's wife a month ago. You'd ought to 'a' turned back to Asheville. They got a good blacksmith there can tinker yer up." "Is that so?" said Gordon interestedly. "Well, now, that's too bad, but perhaps as it can't be helped we'll have to forget it. What's the next town on ahead, and how far?" "Sugar Grove's 2 mile further on, and Milton's 5. They've got a garage and a restaurant to Milton, but that's only since the railroad built a junction there." Has any one here a conveyance I could hire to take us to Milton?" questioned Gordon, looking anxiously about the indolent group. "I wouldn't want to drive to Milton for less than $5," declared a lazy youth after a suitable pause. "Very well," said Gordon. "How soon can you be ready, and what sort of a rig have you? Will it be comfortable for the lady?" The youth eyed the graceful woman in her dainty city dress scornfully. His own country lass was dressed far prettier to his mind, but the eyes of her, so blue like the little weed flowers at her breast, went to his head. His tongue was suddenly tied. "It's all right. It's as good as you'll get," volunteered a sullen faced man half sitting on a sugar barrel. He was of a type who preferred to see fashionable ladies uncomfortable. The youth departed for his team, and after some enquiries Gordon found that he might be able to persuade the owner of the tiny white colonial cottage across the street to prepare a snack for himself and his companion, so they went across the street and waited 15 minutes in a dank little haircloth parlor adorned in funeral wreaths and knit tidies for a delicious breakfast of poached eggs, coffee, homemade bread, butter like roses, and a comb of amber honey. To each the experience was a new one, and they enjoyed it together like two children, letting their eyes speak volumes of comments in the midst of the old lady's volubility. Unconsciously, by their experiences, they were being brought into sympathy with each other. The rig, when it arrived at the door, driven by the blushing youth, proved to be a high spring wagon with 2 seats. In the front one the youth lounged without a thought of assisting his passengers. Gordon swung the baggage up, and then lifted the girl into the back seat, himself taking the place beside her and planting a firm hand and arm behind the backless seat that she might feel more secure. That ride, with his arm behind her, was just one more link in the pretty chain of sympathy that was being welded about these two. Unconsciously, more and more she began to droop, until when she grew very tired he seemed to know at once. "Just lean against my arm," he said. "You must be very tired, and it will help you bear the jolting." He spoke as if his arm were made of wood or iron, and was merely one of his belongings, like an umbrella or a suitcase. He made it seem quite the natural thing for her to lean against him. If he had claimed it as her right and privilege as wife, she would have recoiled from him for recalling to her the hated relation, and would have sat straight as a beanpole the rest of the way. But, as it was, she sank back a trifle deprecatingly, and realized that it was a great help. In her heart she thanked him for making it possible for her to rest, without entirely compromising her attitude toward him. There was nothing about it that suggested anything lover-like. It seemed just a common courtesy. Yet the strong arm almost trembled as he felt the precious weight against it, and he wished that the way were 10 miles instead of 5. Once, as Celia leaned forward to point to a particularly lovely bit of view that opened up as they wound around a curve in the road, they ran over a stone, and the wagon gave an unexpected jolt. Gordon reached his hand out to steady her, and she settled back to his arm with a sense of safety and being cared for that was very pleasant. Looking up shyly, she saw his eyes upon her with that deep look of admiration and something more, and again that strange thrill of joy that had come when he gave her the forget-me-nots swept through her. She felt almost as if she were harboring a sinful thought when she remembered the letters he had written. But the joy of the day, and the sweetness of happiness for even a moment, when she had been for so long a time sad, was so pleasant that she let herself enjoy it and drift, refusing to think evil of him now, here, in this bright day. Thus, like children on a picnic, they passed through Sugar Grove and came to the town of Milton, and there they bade their driver good-bye, rewarding him with a crisp $5 bill. He drove home with a vision of smiles in forget-me-not eyes, and a marked inability to tell anything about his wonderful passengers who had filled the little village with awe and amazement, and had given no clue to anyone as to who or what they were. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10 of The Best Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail Mattern. The Best Man by Grace Livingston Hill. Chapter 10. But to go back to the pursuer in his berth, baffled and frantic and raging. With hands that fumbled because of their very eagerness, he sought to get into his garments and find his shoes from the melee of blankets and other articles in the berth, all the time keeping one eye out of the window, for he must not let his prey get away from him now. He must watch and see what they were going to do. How fortunate that he had wakened in time for that. At least he would have a clue. Where was this? A station? He stopped operations once more to gaze off at the landscape, a desolate country scene to his city-hardened eyes. Not a house in sight, nor a station. The spires of the distant village seemed like a mirage to him. This couldn't be a station. What were those two doing down there, anyway? Dared he risk calling the conductor and having him hold them? No. This affair must be kept absolutely quiet. Mr. Holman had said that if a breath of the matter came out, it was worse than death for all concerned. He must just get off this train as fast as he could and follow them if they were getting away. It might be he could get the man in a lonely place. It would be easy enough to watch his chance and gag the lady. He had done such things before. He felt far more at home in such an affair than he had the night before at the Holman dinner table. What a pity one of the others had not come along. It would be mere child's play for two to handle those two, who looked as if they would turn frightened at the first threat. However, he felt confident that he could manage the affair alone. He panted with haste, and succeeded in getting the wrong legs into his trousers and having to begin all over again, his efforts greatly hampered by the necessity for watching out the window. Then came the distant rumble of an oncoming train, and an answering scream from his own engine. The two on the ground had crossed quickly over the second track and were looking down the steep embankment. Were they going down there? What fate that he was not ready to follow them at once! The train that was coming would pass, their own would start, and he could not get out. His opportunity was going from him, and he could not find his shoes. Well, what of it? He would go without. What were shoes in a time like this? Surely he could get along barefoot, and beg a pair at some farmhouse, or buy a pair at a country store. He must get out at any cost, shoes or no shoes. Grasping his coat, which contained his money and valuables, he sprang from his berth, straight into the arms of the porter, who was hurrying back to his car after having been out to gossip with a brakeman over the delay. "What's de matter, sir?" asked the astonished porter, rallying quickly from the shock and assuming his habitual courtesy. "My shoes!" roared the irate traveller. "What have you done with my shoes?" "Quiet, sir. Please, sir. You wake de whole car," said the porter. "I put your shoes under de berth, sir, right where I always puts 'em after blacking, sir." The porter stooped and extracted the shoes from beneath the curtain, and the traveller, whose experience in Pullmans was small, grabbed them furiously and made for the door, shoes in hand, for with a snort and a lurch and a preliminary jar the train had taken up its motion, and a loud rushing outside proclaimed that the other train was passing. The porter, feeling that he had been treated with injustice, stood gazing reproachfully after the man for a full minute before he followed him to tell him that the washroom was at the other end of the car and not down past the drawing room, as he evidently supposed. He found his man standing in stocking feet on the cold iron platform, his head out of the opening left in the vestibuled train, for when the porter came in he had drawn shut the outer door and slammed down the movable platform, making it impossible for anyone to get out. There was only the little opening the size of a window above the grating guard, and the man clung to it as if he would jump over it if only he dared. He was looking back over the track, and his face was not good to see. He turned wildly upon the porter. "I want you to stop this train and let me off," he shouted. "I've lost something valuable back there on the track. Stop the train quick, I tell you, or I'll sue the railroad." "What was it you lost?" asked the porter respectfully. He wasn't sure but the man was half asleep yet. "It was it was a very valuable paper. It means a fortune to me and several other people, and I must go back and get it. Stop the train, I tell you, at once, or I'll jump out." "I can't stop the train, sir. You'll have to see the conductor, sir, about that. but I specs there's mighty little prospect of getting dis train stopped 'fore it gets to its destination, sir. We's 1 hour ahind time now, sir, and he's got to make up 'fore we gets to Buffalo." The excited passenger railed and stormed until several sleepers were awakened and stuck curious sleepy countenances out from the curtains of their berths; but the porter was obdurate, and would not take any measures to stop the train, nor even call the conductor, until the passenger promised to return quietly to his berth. The thick-set man was not used to obeying, but he saw he was only hindering himself, and finally hurried back to his berth, where he hastily parted the curtains, craning his neck to see back along the track and over the green valley, growing smaller and smaller now in the distance. He could just make out two moving specks on the white winding ribbon of the road. He felt sure he knew the direction they were taking. If he only could get off that train he could easily catch them, for they would have no idea he was coming and would take no precautions. If he had only wakened a few seconds sooner, he would have been following them even now. Fully 10 minutes he argued with the conductor, showing a wide incongruity between his language and his gentlemanly attire; but the conductor would do nothing but promise to set him down at a water tower 10 miles ahead, where they had to slow up for water. He said Sioux or no Sioux, he had his orders, and the thick-set man did not inspire him either to sympathy or confidence. The conductor had been many years on the road, and generally knew when to stop his train and when to let it go on. Sullenly the thick-set man accepted the conductor's decision, and prepared to leave the train at the water tower, his eye out for the landmarks along the way as he completed his hasty toilet. He was in no pleasant frame of mind, having missed a goodly amount of his accustomed stimulants the night before, and seeing little prospect of either stimulants or breakfast before him. He was not built for a 10-mile walk over the cinders, and his flabby muscles already ached at the prospect. But then, of course, he would not have to go far before he found an automobile or some kind of conveyance to help him on his way. He looked eagerly from the window for indications of garages or stables, but the river wound its silver way among the gray-green willow fringes, and the new grass shone a placid emerald plain, with nothing more human than a few cows grazing here and there. Not even a horse that might be borrowed without his owner's knowledge. It was a strange, forsaken spot, 10 whole miles, and no sign of any public livery. Off to the right and left he could see villages, but they were most of them too far away from the track to help him any. It began to look as if he must just foot it all the way. Now and then a small shanty or tiny dwelling whizzed by near at hand, but nothing that would relieve his situation. It occurred to him to go into the dining car for breakfast, but even as he thought of it the conductor told him that the train would stop in 2 minutes, and he must be ready to get off, for they did not stop long. He certainly looked a harmless creature, that thick-set man, as he stood alone upon the cinder elevation and surveyed the landscape o'er. 10 miles from his quarry, alone on a stretch of endless ties and rails, with a gleaming river mocking him down in the valley, and a laughing sky jeering overhead. He started down the shining track, his temper a wreck, his mind in chaos, his soul at war with the world. The worst of it all was that the whole fault was his own for going to sleep. He began to fear that he had lost his chance. Then he set his ugly jaw and strode ahead. The morning sun poured down upon the thick-set man on his pilgrimage, and waxed hotter until noon. Trains whizzed mercilessly by and gave him no succor. Weary, faint, and fiercely thirsty, he came at last to the spot where he was satisfied his quarry had escaped. He could see the marks of their rough descent in the steep cinder bank, and assaying the same himself, came upon a shred of purple silk caught on a bramble at the foot. Puffing and panting, bruised and footsore, he sat down at the very place where Celia had stopped to have her shoes fastened, and mopped his purple brow. But there was triumph in his ugly eye, and after a few moments' rest he trudged onward. That town over there ought to yield both conveyance and food as well as information concerning those he sought. He would catch them. They could never get away from him. He was on their track again, though hours behind. He would get them yet, and no man should take his reward from him. Almost spent, he came at last to the village, and ate a surprisingly large dish of beef and vegetable stew at the quaint little house where Celia and Gordon had breakfasted. But the old lady who served it to them was shy about talking, and though admitting that a couple of people had been there that morning, she was non-committal about their appearance. They might have been young and good-looking and worn feathers in their hats, and they might not. She wasn't one for noticing people's appearance if they treated her civilly and paid their bills. Would he have another cup of coffee? He would, and also 2 more pieces of pie, but he got very little further information. It was over at the corner store, where he finally went in search of something stronger than coffee, that he further pursued his investigations. The loungers were still there. It was their only business in life, and they were most diligent in it. They eyed the newcomer with a relish, and settled back on their various barrels and boxes to enjoy whatever entertainment the gods were about to provide to relieve their monotonous existence. A house divided against itself cannot stand. This man's elegant garments, assumed for the nonce, did not fit the rest of his general appearance, which had been accentuated by his long, hot, dusty tramp. The high evening hat was jammed on the back of his head and bore a decided dent where it had rolled down the cinder embankment. His collar was wilted and lifeless, his white laundered tie at half-mast, his coat awry, and his fine patent leather shoes, which pinched, were covered with dust, and had caused a limp like the hardest tramp upon the road. Moreover, the speech of the man betrayed him, and the keen-minded old gossips who were watching him suspiciously sized him up at once the minute he opened his mouth. "Saw anything of a couple of young folks walking down this way?" he inquired casually, pausing to light a cigar with which he was reinforcing himself for further travel. One man allowed that there might have passed such people that day. He hardly seemed willing to commit himself, but another vouchsafed the information that Joe here drove 2 parties of that description to Milton this morning. Just got back. Maybe he could answer for 'em." Joe frowned. He did not like the looks of the thick-set man. He still remembered the forget-me-not eyes. But the stranger made instant request to be driven to Milton, offering $10 for the same when he found that his driver was reluctant, and that Milton was a railroad center. A few keen questions had made him sure that his man had gone to Milton. Joe haggled, allowed his horse was tired, and he didn't care about the trip twice in one day, but finally agreed to take the man for $15, and sauntered off to get a fresh horse. He had no mind to be in a hurry. He had his own opinion about letting those 2 parties get out of the way before the third put in an appearance. But he had no mind to lose the $15. It would help to buy the ring he coveted for his girl. In due time, Joe rode leisurely up, and the impatient traveller climbed into the high spring wagon and was driven away from the apathetic gaze of the country loungers, who unblinkingly took in the fact that Joe was headed toward Asheville, and evidently intended taking his fare to Milton by way of that village, a 30-mile drive at least. The man would get the worth of his money and ride. A grim twinkle sat in their several eyes as the spring wagon turned the curve in the road and was lost to sight, and after due silence an old stager spoke. "Do you reckon that was their chauffeur?" he requested languidly. "Nah," replied a farmer's son vigorously. "He wouldn't try to chauffe all dolled up like that. He's the rich dad comin' after the runaways. Joe don't intend he shall get 'em a while yet. I reckon the ceremony'll be over before he steps in to interfere." This lad went twice a month to Milton to the movies, and was regarded as an authority on matters of romance. A pause showed that his theory had taken root in the minds of his auditors. "Well, I reckon Joe thinks the longest way round is the shortest way home," declared the old stager. "Joe never did like them codfish swells, but how do you account for the style of that gal? She wa'n't like her dad one little bit." "Oh, she's been to college, I suppose," declared the youth. "They get all that off in college." "Serves the old man right for sending his gal to a fool college when she ought to have been home learning to housekeep. I hope she gets off with her young man all right," said a grim old lounger, and a cackle of laughter went round the group, which presently broke up, for this had been a strenuous day, and all felt their need of rest. Besides, they wanted to get home and tell the news before some neighbor got ahead of them. All this time Celia and Gordon were touring Milton, serenely unconscious of danger near, or guardian angel of the name Joe. Investigation disclosed the fact that there was a train for Pittsburgh about 3 in the afternoon. Gordon sent a code telegram to his chief, assuring him of the safety of the message and of his own intention to proceed to Washington as fast as steam could carry him. Then he took the girl to a restaurant, where they mounted 2 high stools and partook with an unusually ravenous appetite of nearly everything on the menu: corn, soup, roast beef, baked trout, stewed tomatoes, coleslaw, custard, apple and mince pies, with a cup of good country coffee and real cream, all for 25 cents apiece. It was a very merry meal. Celia felt somehow as if for the time all memory of the past had been taken from her, and she were free to think and act happily in the present, without any great problems to solve or decisions to make. Just 2 young people off having a good time they were, at least until that afternoon train came. After their dinner they took a short walk to a tiny park where 2 white ducks disported themselves on a 7x9 pond, spanned by a rustic bridge where lovers had cut their initials. Gordon took out his knife and idly cut C.H. in the rough bark of the upper rail, while his companion sat on the little board seat and watched him. She was pondering over the fact that he had cut her initials and not his own. It would have been like the George of old to cut his own and never once think of hers. And he had put but 1 H. Probably thought of her now as Celia Hayne, without the Hathaway, or else he was so used to writing her name Celia Hathaway that he was not thinking at all. Those letters! How they haunted her and clouded every bright experience that she fain would have grasped and held for a little hour. They were silent now while he worked, and she thought. He had finished the C.H. and was cutting another C, but instead of making another H, he carefully carved out the letter G. What was that for? C.G.? Who was C.G.? Oh, how stupid! George, of course. He had started a C by mistake. But he did not add the expected H. Instead, he snapped his knife shut, laid his hand over the carving, and leaned over the rail. "Sometime, perhaps, we'll come here again and remember," he said, and then bethought him that he had no right to hope for any such anniversary. "Oh!" She looked up into his eyes, startled, troubled, the haunting of her fears in the shadows of the blue. He looked down into them and read her trouble, read and understood, and looked back his great desire to comfort her. His look carried further than he meant it should. For the 3rd time that day a thrill of wonder and delight passed over her, and left her fearful with a strange joy that she felt she should put from her. It was only an instant, that look, but it brought the bright color to both faces, and made Gordon feel the immediate necessity of changing the subject. "See those little fishes down there," he said, pointing to the tiny lake below them. Through a blur of tears the girl looked down and saw the tiny, sharp-finned creatures darting here and there in a beam of sun like a small searchlight set to show them off. She moved her hand on the rail to lean further over, and her soft fingers touched his hand for a moment. She would not draw them away quickly, lest she hurt him. Why, she did not know, but she could not, would not hurt him. Not now. The 2 hands lay side by side for a full minute, and the touch to Gordon was as if a rose leaf had kissed his soul. He had never felt anything sweeter. He longed to gather the little hand into his clasp and feel its pulses trembling there, as he had felt it in the church the night before. But she was not his. He would not touch her till she had had her choice of what to do, and she would never choose him, never, when she knew how he had deceived her. That one supreme moment they had of perfect consciousness of the drawing of soul to soul, of the sweetness of that hovering touch of hands, of the longing to know and understand each other. Then a sharp whistle sounded, and a farmer's boy with a new rake and a sack of corn on his shoulder came sauntering briskly down the road to the bridge. Instantly they drew apart, and Celia felt that she had been on the verge of disloyalty to her true self. They walked silently back to the station, each busy with his own thoughts, each conscious of that one moment when the other had come so near. End of chapter 10. Of The Best Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail Mattern. The Best Man by Grace Livingston Hill. Chapter 11. There were a lot of people at the station. They had been to a family gathering of some sort from their remarks, and they talked loudly and much, so that the two stood apart, for the seats were all occupied, and had no opportunity for conversation, save a quiet, smiling comment now and then upon the chatter about them or the odd remarks they heard. There had come a constraint upon them, a withdrawing of each into his shell, each conscious of something that separated. Gordon struggled to prevent it, but he seemed helpless. Celia would smile in answer to his quiet remarks, but it was a smile of distance, such as she had worn early in the morning. She had quite found her former standing ground, with its fence of prejudice, and she was repairing the breaks through which she had gone over to the enemy during the day. She was bracing herself with dire reminders, and snatches from those terrible letters which were written in characters of fire in her heart. Never, never could she care for a man who had done what this man had done. She had forgotten for a little while those terrible things he had said of her dear dead father. How could she have forgotten for an instant? How could she have let her hand lie close to the hand that had defiled itself by writing such things? By the time they were seated in the train, she was freezing in her attitude, and poor Gordon sat miserably beside her, and tried to think what he had done to offend her. It was not his fault that her hand had lain near his on the rail. She had put it there herself. Perhaps she expected him to put his over it, to show her that he cared as a bridegroom should care, as he did care in reality, if he only had the right. And perhaps she was hurt that he had stood coolly, and said or done nothing, but he could not help it. Much to Gordon's relief, the train carried a parlor car, and it happened on this particular day to be almost deserted, save for a deaf old man with a florid complexion and a gold-knobbed cane, who slumbered audibly at the further end from the two chairs Gordon selected. He established his companion comfortably, disposed of the baggage, and sat down, but the girl paid no heed to him. With a sad, set face, she stared out of the window, her eyes seeming to see nothing. For 2 hours she sat so, he making remarks occasionally, to which she made little or no reply, until he lapsed into silence, looking at her with troubled eyes. Finally, just as they neared the outskirts of Pittsburgh, he leaned softly forward and touched her coat sleeve to attract her attention. "Have I offended, hurt you in any way?" he asked gently. She turned toward him, and her eyes were brimming full of tears. "No," she said, and her lips were trembling. "No, you have been most kind, but I cannot forget those letters," she ended with a sob, and put up her handkerchief quickly to stifle it. "Letters?" he asked helplessly. "What letters?" "The letters you wrote me. All the letters of the last 5 months. I cannot forget them. I can never forget them. How could you think I could?" He looked at her anxiously, not knowing what to say, and yet he must say something. The time had come when some kind of an understanding, some clearing up of facts, must take place. He must go cautiously, but he must find out what was the matter. He could not see her suffer so. There must be some way to let her know that so far as he was concerned she need suffer nothing further, and that he would do all in his power to set her right with the world. But letters! He had written no letters. His face lighted up with the swift certainty of one thing about which he had dared not be sure. She still thought him the man she had intended to marry. She was not, therefore, troubled about that phase of the question. It was strange, almost unbelievable, but it was true that he personally was not responsible for the trouble in her eyes. What trouble she might feel when she knew all, he had yet to find out, but it was a great relief to be sure of so much. Still, something must be said. "Letters?" he repeated again stupidly, and then added with perplexed tone, "Would you mind telling me just what it was in the letters that hurt you?" She turned eyes of astonishment on him. "How can you ask?" she said bitterly. "You surely must know how terrible they were to me. You could not be the man you have seemed to be today if you did not know what you were doing to me in making all those terrible threats. You must know how cruel they were." "I'm afraid I don't understand," he said earnestly, the trouble still most apparent in his eyes. "Would you mind being a little more explicit? Would you mind telling me exactly what you think I wrote you that sounded like a threat?" He asked the question half hesitatingly, because he was not quite sure whether he was justified in thus obtaining private information under false pretenses, and yet he felt that he must know just what troubled her, or he could never help her, and he was sure that if she knew he was an utter stranger, even a kindly one, those gentle lips would never open to inform him upon her torturer. As it was, she could tell him her trouble with a perfectly clear conscience, thinking she was telling it to the man who knew all about it. But his hesitation about prying into an utter stranger's private affairs, even with a good motive, gave him an air of troubled dignity and real anxiety to know his fault that puzzled the girl more than all that had gone before. "I cannot understand how you can ask such a question, since it has been the constant subject of discussion in all our letters," she replied, sitting up with asperity and drying her tears. She was on the verge of growing angry with him for his petty, willful misunderstanding of words whose meaning she felt he must know well. "I do ask it," he said quietly, "and believe me, I have a good motive in doing so." She looked at him in surprise. It was impossible to be angry with those kindly eyes, even though he did persist in a willful stupidity. "Well, then, since you wish it stated once more, I will tell you," she declared, the tears welling again into her eyes. "You first demanded that I marry you. Demanded, without any pretense whatever of caring for me, with a hidden threat in your demand that if I did not, you would bring some dire calamity upon me by means that were already in your power. You took me for the same foolish little girl whom you had delighted to tease for years before you went abroad to live. And when I refused you, you told me that you could not only take away from my mother all the property which she had inherited from her brother by means of a will made just before my uncle's death, and unknown except to his lawyer and you, but that you could and would blacken my dear dead father's name and honor, and show that every cent that belonged to mother and Jefferson and myself was stolen property. When I challenged you to prove any such thing against my honored father, you went still further and threatened to bring out a terrible story and prove it with witnesses who would swear to anything you said. You knew my father's white life. You as much as owned your charges were false, and yet you dared to send me a letter from a vile creature who pretended that she was his first wife, and who said she could prove that he had spent much of his time in her company. You knew the whole thing was a falsehood, but you dared to threaten to make this known through the newspapers if I did not marry you. You realized that I knew that, even though few people and no friends would believe such a thing of my father, such a report in the papers, false though it was, would crush my mother to death. You knew that I would give my life to save her, and so you had me in your power, as you have me now. You have always wanted me in your power, just because you love to torture, and now you have me. But you cannot make me forget what you have done. I have given my life, but I cannot give any more. If it is not sufficient, you will have to do your worst." She dropped her face into the little wet handkerchief, and Gordon sat with white, drawn countenance, and clenched hands, he was fairly trembling with indignation toward the villain who had thus dared impose upon this delicate flower of womanhood. He longed to search the world over for the false bridegroom, and finding, give him his just dues. And what should he do or say? Dared he tell her at once who he was, and trust to her kind heart to forgive his terrible blunder, and keep his secret till the message was safely delivered? Dared he? Had he any right? No, the secret was not his to divulge, either for his own benefit or for any other's. He must keep that to himself, but he must help her in some way. At last he began to speak, scarcely knowing what he was about to say. "It is terrible, terrible what you have told me. To have written such things to one like you, in fact, to anyone on earth, seems to me unforgivable. It is the most inhuman cruelty I have ever heard of. You were fully justified in hating and despising the man who wrote such words to you." "Then why did you write them?" she burst forth. "And how can you sit there calmly and talk that way about it, as if you had nothing to do with the matter?" "Because I never wrote those letters," he said, looking her steadily, earnestly in the eyes. "You never wrote them!" she exclaimed excitedly. "You dare to deny it?" "I dare to deny it." His voice was quiet, earnest, convincing. She looked at him, dazed, bewildered, indignant, sorrowful. "But you cannot deny it," she said, her fragile frame trembling with excitement. "I have the letters all in my suitcase. You cannot deny your own handwriting. I have the last awful one, the one in which you threatened father's good name, here in my handbag. I dared not put it with the rest, and I had no opportunity to destroy it before leaving home. I felt as if I must always keep it with me, lest otherwise its awful secret would somehow get out. There it is. Read it, and see your own name signed to the words you say you did not write." While she talked, her trembling fingers had taken a folded, crumpled letter from her little handbag, and this she reached over and laid upon the arm of the chair. "Read it," she said. "Read it, and see that you cannot deny it." "I should rather not read it," he said. "I do not need to read it to deny that I ever wrote such things to you." "But I insist that you read it," said the girl. "If you insist, I will read it," he said, taking the letter reluctantly and opening it. She sat watching him furtively through the tears while he read, saw the angry flush steal into his cheeks as the villainy of a fellow man was revealed to him through the brief, coarse, cruel epistle, and she mistook the flush for one of shame. Then his true brown eyes looked up and met her tearful gaze steadily, a fine anger burning in them. "And do you think I wrote that?" he said, something in his voice she could not understand. "What else could I think? It bears your signature," she answered coldly. "The letter is vile," he said, "and the man who wrote it is a blackguard, and deserves the utmost that the law allows for such offences. With your permission, I shall make it my business to see that he gets it." "What do you mean?" she said, wide-eyed. "How could you punish yourself? You cannot still deny that you wrote the letter." "I still deny that I wrote it, or ever saw it until you handed it to me just now." The girl looked at him nonplussed, more than half convinced, in spite of her reason. "But isn't that your handwriting?" "It is not. Look." He took out his fountain pen, and holding the letter on the arm of her chair, he wrote rapidly, in his natural hand, her own name and address beneath the address on the envelope, then held it up to her. Did they look alike? The two writings were as utterly unlike as possible, the letter being addressed in an almost unreadable scrawl, and the fresh writing standing fine and clear, in a script that spoke of character and business ability. Even a child could see at a glance that the two were not written by the same hand, and yet, of course, it might have been practised for the purpose of deception. This thought flashed through the minds of both, even as he held it out for her to look. She looked from the envelope to his eyes and back to the letter, startled, not knowing what to think. But before either of them had time for another word, the conductor, the porter, and several people from the car behind came hurriedly through, and they realized that while they talked the train had come to a halt amid the blazing electric lights of a great city station. "Why," said Gordon, startled, "we must have reached Pittsburgh." "Is this Pittsburgh?" he called out to the vanishing porter. "Yes, sir," yelled the porter, putting his head around the curve of the passageway. "You better hurry, sir, for this train goes on to Cincinnati pretty quick. We is late getting in, you see." Neither of them had noticed a man in rough clothes with slouch hat and hands in his pockets, who had boarded the train a few miles back and walked through the car several times, eyeing them keenly. He stuck his head in at the door now furtively, and drew back quickly again out of sight. Gordon hurriedly gathered up the baggage, and they went out of the car, the porter rushing back as they reached the door to assist them and get a last tip. There was no opportunity to say anything more as they mingled with the crowd until the porter landed their baggage in the great station and hurried back to his train. The man with the slouch hat followed and stood unobtrusively behind them. Gordon looked down at the white, drawn face of the girl, and his heart was touched with compassion for her trouble. He must make her some satisfactory explanation at once that would set her heart at rest, but he could not do it here, for every seat about them was filled with noisy, chattering folk. He stooped and whispered low and tenderly, "Don't worry, little girl. Just try to trust me, and I will explain it all." "Can you explain it?" she asked anxiously, as if catching at a rope thrown out to save her life. "Perfectly," he said, "if you will be patient and trust me. But we cannot talk here. Just wait in this seat until I see if I can get the stateroom on the sleeper." He left her with his courteous bow, and she sat watching his tall, fine figure as he threaded his way among the crowds to the Pullman window, her heart filled with mingling emotions. In spite of her reason, a tiny bit of hope for the future was springing up in her heart, and without her own will she found herself inclined to trust him. At least it was all she could do at present. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of The Best Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail Mattern. The Best Man by Grace Livingston Hill. Chapter 12. Back at Milton, an hour before, when the shades of dusk were falling and a slender moon hung timidly on the edge of the horizon, a horse, drawing a spring wagon, ambled deliberately into town and came to a reluctant halt beside the railroad station, having made a wide detour through the larger part of the county on the way to that metropolis. The sun had been hot, the road much of it rough, and the jolts over stones and bumps had not added to the comfort of the thick-set man, already bruised and weary from his travels. Joe's conversation had not ceased. He had given his guest a wide range of topics, discoursing learnedly on the buckwheat crop and the blight that might be expected to assail the cherry trees. He pointed out certain portions of land infested with rattlesnakes, and told blood-curdling stories of experiences with stray bears and wild cats in a maple grove through which they passed, till the passenger looked furtively behind him and urged the driver to hurry a little faster. Joe, seeing his gullibility, only made his stories of country life the bigger, for the thick-set man, though bold as a lion in his own city haunts, was a coward in the unknown world of the country. When the traveller, looking at his watch, urged Joe to make haste and asked how many miles further Milton was, Joe managed it that the horse should stumble on a particularly stony bit of road. Then, getting down gravely from the wagon, he examined the horse's feet each in turn, shaking his head sadly over the left forefoot. "Jes' as I supposed," he meditated dreamily. "Stone bruise. Lame horse. Don't believe I ought to go on. Sorry, but it'll be the ruination of the horse. You ain't in a hurry, I hope." The passenger, in great excitement, promised to double the fare if the young man would get another horse and hurry him forward, and after great professions of doubt Joe gave in and said he would try the horse, but it wouldn't do to work him hard. They would have to let him take his time. He couldn't on any account leave the horse behind anywhere and get a fresh one, because it belonged to his best friend, and he promised to bring it back safe and sound. They would just take their time and go slow and see if the horse could stand it. He wouldn't think of trying it if it weren't for the extra money which he needed. So the impatient traveller was dragged fuming along, weary hour after weary hour, through the monotonous glory of a spring afternoon of which he saw nothing but the dust of the road, as he tried to count the endless miles. Every mile or two Joe would descend from the wagon seat and fuss around the horse's leg, the horse nothing loth at such unprecedented attention, dozing cozily by the roadside during the process. And so was the traveller brought to his destination 10 minutes after the last train that stopped at Milton that night had passed the station. The telegraph office was not closed, however, and without waiting to haggle, the passenger paid his $30 for the longest journey he ever took, and disappeared into the station, while Joe, whipping up his petted animal and whistling cheerily, "Where did you get that girl?" went rattling down the shortcut from Milton home at a surprising pace for a lame horse. He was eating his supper at home in a little more than an hour, and the horse seemed to have miraculously recovered from his stone bruise. Joe was wondering how his girl would look in a hat with purple plumes, and thinking of his $30 with a chuckle. It was surprising how much that thick-set man, weary and desperate though he was, could accomplish when once he reached the telegraph station and sent his messages flying on their way. In less than 3 minutes after his arrival he had extracted from the station agent the fact that 2 people, man and woman, answering the description he gave, had bought tickets for Pittsburgh and taken the afternoon train for that city. The agent had noticed them on account of their looking as if they came from the city. He especially noticed the purple plumes, the like of which he had never seen before. He had taken every minute he could get off from his selling tickets and sending telegrams to watch the lady through his little cobwebby window. They didn't wear hats like that in Milton. In 10 minutes one message was on its way to a crony in Pittsburgh, with whom the thick-set man kept in constant touch for just such occasions as the present, stirring him to strenuous action. Another message had winged its mysterious way to Mr. Holman, giving him the main facts in the case, while a third message caught another crony 30 miles north of Pittsburgh and ordered him to board the evening express at his own station, hunt up the parties described, and shadow them to their destination, if possible getting in touch with the Pittsburgh crony when he reached the city. The pursuer then ate a ham sandwich with liberal washings of liquid fire, while he awaited replies to some of his messages, and as soon as he was satisfied that he had set justice in motion, he hired an automobile and hied him across country to catch a midnight express to Pittsburgh. He had given orders that his man and accompanying lady should be held in Pittsburgh until his arrival, and he had no doubt but that the orders would be carried out. So sure was he that he was on the right track, and that his cronies would be able and willing to follow his orders. There was some kind of an excursion on at Pittsburgh, and the place was crowded. The trainmen kept calling off specials, and crowds hurried out of the waiting room, only to be replaced by other crowds, all eager, pushing, talking, laughing. They were mostly men, but a good many women and some children seemed to be of the number, and the noise and excitement worried her after her own exciting afternoon. Celia longed to lay her down and sleep, but the seat was narrow and hard, and people were pressing on every side. That disagreeable man in the slouch hat would stand too near. He was most repulsive looking, though he did not seem to be aware of her presence. Gordon had a long wait before he finally secured the coveted stateroom and started back to her, when suddenly a face that he knew loomed up in the crowd and startled him. It was the face of a private detective who was well known about Washington, but whose headquarters were in New York. Until that instant it had not occurred to him to fear watchers so far south and west as Pittsburgh. It was not possible that the other bridegroom would think to track him here. And as for the Holman contingent, they would not be likely to make a public disturbance about his disappearance, lest they be found to have some connection with the first theft of government property. They could have watchers only through private means, and they must have been wily indeed if they had anticipated his move through Pittsburgh to Washington. Still, it was the natural move for him to make in order to get home as quickly as possible and yet escape them. And this man in the crowd was the very one whom they would have been likely to pick out for their work. He was as slippery in his dealings as they must be, and no doubt was in league with them. He knew the man and his ways thoroughly, and had no mind to fall into his hands. Whether he had been seen by the detective yet or not, he could not tell, but he suspected he had, by the way the man stood around and avoided recognizing him. There was not an instant to be lost. The fine stateroom must go untenanted. He must make a dash for Liberty. Liberty! Ah! East Liberty! What queer things these brains of ours are! He knew Pittsburgh just a little. He remembered having caught a train at East Liberty Station once, when he had not time to come down to the station to take it. Perhaps he might get the same train at East Liberty. It was nearly 2 hours before it left. Swooping down upon the baggage, he murmured in the girl's ear, "Can you hurry a little? We must catch a car right away." She followed him closely through the crowd, he stooping as if to look down at his suitcase so that his height might not attract the attention of the man whose recognition he feared, and in a moment more they were out in the lighted blackness of the streets. One glance backward showed his supposed enemy stretching his neck above the crowd as if searching for someone, as he walked hurriedly toward the very doorway they had just passed. Behind them shadowed the man in the slouch hat, and with a curious motion of his hand signaled another like himself, the Pittsburgh crony, who skulked in the darkness outside. Instantly this man gave another signal, and out of the gloom of the street a carriage drew up at the curb before the door, the cabman looking eagerly for patronage. Gordon put both suitcases in one hand, and taking Celia's arm as gently as he could in his haste, hurried her toward the carriage. It was the very refuge he sought. He placed her inside and gave the order for East Liberty Station, drawing a long breath of relief at being safely out of the station. He did not see the shabby one who mounted the box beside the driver and gave his directions in guttural whispers, nor the man with the slouch hat who watched from the doorway and followed them to a familiar haunt on the nearest car. He only felt how good it was to be by themselves once more, where they could talk together without interruption. But conversation was not easy under the circumstances. The noise of wagons, trains, and cars was so great at the station that they could think of nothing but the din, and when they had threaded their way out of the tangle and started rattling over the pavement, the driver went at such a furious pace that they could still only converse by shouting, and that not at all satisfactorily. It seemed a strange thing that any cabman should drive at such a rapid rate within the city limits, but as Gordon was anxious to get away from the station and the keen-eyed detective as fast as possible, he thought nothing of it at first. After a shouted word or two, they ceased to try to talk, and Gordon, half shyly, reached out a reassuring hand and laid it on the girl's shrinking one that lay in her lap. He had not meant to keep it there but a second, just to make her understand that all was well, and he would soon be able to explain things. But as she did not seem to resent it, nor draw her own away, he yielded to the temptation and kept the small gloved hand in his. The carriage rattled on, bumpity-bump over rough places, around corners, tilting now and then sideways, and Celia, half frightened, was forced to cling to her protector to keep from being thrown on the floor of the cab. "Oh, are we running away?" she breathed awesomely into his ear. "I think not, dear," he answered back, the last word inaudible. "The driver thinks we are in a hurry, but he has no need to go at this furious pace. I will tell him." He leaned forward and tapped on the glass, but the driver paid no attention whatever, save perhaps to drive faster. Could it be that he had lost control of his horse and could not stop? Or hadn't he heard? Gordon tried again, and accompanied the knocking this time with a shout, but all to no purpose. The cab rattled steadily on. Gordon discovered now that there were two men on the box instead of one, and a sudden premonition sent a thrill of alarm through him. What if, after all, the presence of that detective had been a warning, and he, unheeding, had walked into a trap? What a fool he had been to get into a carriage where he was at the mercy of the driver! He ought to have stayed in open places where kidnapping would be impossible. Now that he had thought of it, he felt convinced that this was just what the enemy would try to do, kidnap him. The more fruitless he found his efforts to make the driver hear him, the more he felt convinced that something was wrong. He tried to open the door next to him and found it stuck. He put all his strength forth to turn the catch, but it held fast. Then a cold sweat stood out upon him, and horror filled his mind. His commission, with its large significance to the country, was in imminent jeopardy. His own life was in all probability hanging in the balance, but most of all he felt the awful peril of the sweet girl by his side. What terrible experiences might be hers within the next hour if his brain and right arm could not protect her! Instinctively his hand went to the pocket where he had kept his revolver ready since ever he had left Washington. Danger should not find him utterly unprepared. He realized, too, that it was entirely possible that his alarms were unfounded, that the driver was really taking them to the East Liberty station, that the door merely stuck, and he was needlessly anxious. He must keep a steady head, and not let his companion see that he was nervous. The first thing was to find out, if possible, where they really were, but that was a difficult task. The street over which they rattled was utterly dark with the gloom of a smoky city added to the night. There were no street lights except at wide intervals, and the buildings appeared to be blank walls of darkness, probably great warehouses. The way was narrow and entirely unknown. Gordon could not tell if he had ever been there before. He was sure from his knowledge of the stations that they had gone much farther than to East Liberty, and the darkness and loneliness of the region through which they were passing filled him again with a vague alarm. It occurred to him that he might be able to get the window sash down and speak to the driver, and he struggled with the one on his own side for a while, with little result, for it seemed to have been plugged up with wads of paper all around. This fact renewed his anxiety. It began to look as if there was intention in sealing up that carriage. He leaned over and felt around the sash of the opposite door, and found the paper wads there also. There certainly was intention. Not to alarm Celia, he straightened back and went to work again at his own window sash, cautiously pulling out the paper, until at last he could let down the glass. A rush of dank air rewarded his efforts, and the girl drew a breath of relief. Gordon never knew how near she had been to fainting at that moment. She was sitting perfectly quiet in her corner, watching him, her fears kept to herself, though her heart was beating wildly. She was convinced that the horse was running away. Gordon leaned his head out of the window, but immediately he caught the gleam of a revolver in a hand that hung at the side of the driver's box, pointed downward straight toward his face, as if with intention to be ready in case of need. The owner of the hand was not looking toward him, but was talking in muffled tones to the driver. They evidently had not heard the window let down, but were ready for the first sign of an attempt on the part of their victims to escape. Quietly Gordon drew in his head, speculating rapidly on the possibility of wrenching that revolver out of its owner's hand. He could do it from where he sat, but would it be wise? They were probably locked in a trap, and the driver was very likely armed also. What chance would he have to save Celia if he brought on a desperate fight at this point? If he were alone, he might knock that revolver out of the man's hand and spring from the window, taking his chance of getting away. But now he had Celia to think of, and the case was different. Not for a universe of governments could he leave a woman in such desperate straits. She must be considered first, even ahead of the message. This was life and death. He wondered at his own coolness as he sat back in the carriage and quietly lifted the glass frame back into place. Then he laid a steady hand on Celia's again, and stooping close, whispered into her ear: "I'm afraid there's something wrong with our driver. Can you be a little brave, dear?" He did not know he had used the last word this time, but it thrilled into the girl's heart with a sudden accession of trust. "Oh, yes," she breathed close to his face. "You don't think he has been drinking, do you?" "Well, perhaps," said Gordon, relieved at the explanation. "But keep calm. I think we can get out of this all right. Suppose you change seats with me and let me try if that door will open easily. We might want to get out in a hurry in case he slows up somewhere pretty soon." Celia quietly and swiftly slipped into Gordon's seat, and he applied himself with all his strength and ingenuity, gently manipulating the latch and pressing his shoulder against the door until at last, to his joy, it gave way reluctantly, and he found that it would swing open. He had worked carefully, else the sudden giving of the latch would have thrown him out of the carriage and given instant alarm to his driver. He was so thoroughly convinced by this time that he was being kidnapped, perhaps to be murdered, that every sense was on the alert. It was his characteristic to be exceedingly cool during a crisis. It was the quality that the keen-eyed chief had valued most in him, and the final reason why he had been selected for this difficult task in place of an older and more experienced man, who at times lost his head. The door to the outside world being open, Gordon cautiously took a survey of the enemy from that side. There was no gleaming weapon here. The man sat grimly enough, laying on the whip and muttering curses to his bony horse, who galloped recklessly on as if partaking of the desperate desires of his master. In the distance Gordon could hear the rumbling of an oncoming train. The street was still dark, and scarcely a vehicle or person to be seen. There seemed no help at hand, and no opportunity to get out, for they were still rushing at a tremendous pace. An attempt to jump now would very likely result in broken limbs, which would only leave them in a worse plight than they were. He slipped back to his own seat and put Celia next to the free door again. She must be where she could get out first if the opportunity presented itself. Also, he must manage to throw out the suitcases if possible, on account of the letters and valuables they contained. Instinctively his hand sought Celia's in the darkness again, and hers nestled into it in a frightened way, as if his strength gave her comfort. Then, before they could speak or realize, there came the rushing sound of a train almost upon them, and the cab came to a halt with a jerk, the driver pulling the horse far back on his haunches to stop him. The shock almost threw Celia to the floor, but Gordon's arm about her steadied her, and instantly he was on the alert. End of chapter 12.